Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine Kub reviews the USDA's latest production estimates. Karla Jenkins describes nutrient demands for cows grazing corn stalks. Tamra Jackson-Ziems talks about using disease histories to select seed corn varieties. And Schulz looks at the continued strength in hog market prices. Elaine Kub is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. As the 2017 harvest winds down, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Thursday released its final in-season estimates on the sizes of this year's crops. The agency increased corn production to nearly 14.6 billion bushels with the help of a record-setting average yield of 175.4 bushels per acre. The USDA's soybean projection was much tamer, with total output lowered less than 1%. We talked with Elaine shortly after the release and asked for her initial reaction.
Well, my reaction, and probably everybody looking at that report's reaction, was the same thing, was just to focus on the corn yield number. So everybody going into this November report was expecting the USDA to increase the corn yield by a little bit compared to their October number. And then today they came out with this number, 175.4 bushels per acre. Jeff, that is higher even than the 2016 record high. So the USDA is seeing this year's corn yield as a record high yield. And I think that's just flabbergasting. You know, I'm standing in a cornfield in Edmonds County, South Dakota, where we had drought. And so obviously I have some backyarditis and feel that yields are not great here, but it wasn't just localized. I mean, there were problems all through this growing season. So I think everybody was really kind of stunned by that record high yield number.
Well, the USDA found better yields than in October in South Dakota, but also in 4 of the top 5 corn-producing states. Only Nebraska was the outlier. Can you explain why that might be?
Yeah, so there was, better than October by 6 or 8 bushels per acre for some of those states, the major states, Iowa, Illinois. Well, the reason why is when they went out there into the fields and checked the ears, they had high ear weights, higher than in most recent years. Not higher than the 2016 ear weights, but nevertheless higher than they saw in October, and that is what it took to justify this huge yield number.
I guess I should have asked, are you surprised that the agency didn't touch the soybean estimate hardly at all?
Not necessarily. I feel given the progress of the harvest, that one made sense, and that pretty much matched expectations, is that you would continue to have that same soybean yield number right where it is, and the soybean overall production numbers. That one was fine. That one didn't surprise anybody.
And the use numbers in soybeans weren't changed. In corn, the number that I think was maybe a little surprising was an increase in corn exports by 75 million bushels. Can you explain why that might be noteworthy?
Well, I can't explain why they did it, and maybe that's what's noteworthy about it, is that they didn't really have a lot of justification in the week-to-week export progress numbers to make that sudden adjustment. You know, for wheat, they talked about a higher sales being made to Iraq. They had justification for raising the wheat export projections. But for corn, there didn't seem to be a lot of explanation for that or justification for that, other than perhaps just the low price. This very low, stable price is perhaps likely to motivate some of our consumers domestically too. In the feed and residual category, they bumped up those numbers too, perhaps just based on this idea that the nice low steady price will encourage some more use.
We're talking about an hour after the report was released. What's the initial price reaction to these numbers?
Yeah, so like I said, we were all flabbergasted by the big corn number, and then we all kind of sat around and waited and looked at the charts, and the strangest thing happened, Jeff. absolutely nothing. The corn price is still just absolutely stuck somewhere between $3.45 and $3.50, where it has been absolutely sideways in, just nothing going on for months now, and nothing even on this very strange report day. Still, nothing happened.
Down about a nickel the last time we looked before we started here. Do you think it continues a loss into tomorrow, or why do you think it's not going further?
Well, I don't necessarily, if this is not motivating a lot of speculative, bearish selling in the corn market, then nothing else will. I mean, this was the last opportunity that USDA really had to add in new bearish information to that fundamental tables. So without that, I think our bearish opportunities might be behind us. And already the speculative traders that managed money segment of the market was very short in their futures positions. They had 2-to-1 short positions compared to their long positions. So they are not, it doesn't seem like they're inclined to be adding to their bearishness. In fact, when you look at their behavior across all of the commodity markets, they seem to be aiming more towards investing in the long side, making a play on an improving economy. So there is potential certainly for corn to stay stable. I think that's the status quo right now, but potential even perhaps for it to follow soybeans, which have built kind of a higher trend.
What do you think this means for selling strategies?
I think for soybeans, you look at that soybean chart, and it has taken more of a hit today, sort of unexplained why, but it has taken a little bit more of a hit, but nevertheless, it's fairly stable on a higher trend, and I think it's possible for soybeans to continue back towards their $10 level that we saw in October, especially if we had, new poor weather in Brazil, which we don't at the moment, but that could happen. So in soybeans, I would hold off on selling in the near term, but for corn, I think this is where we're at.
Any implications to basis?
No, I think basis has normalized. So, at the early part of the harvest when there was the trouble with the river shipping, there were very strange national basis patterns. But now you look on a nationwide basis, picture, all of the basis numbers seem to be about where you'd expect them to be in the latter part of harvest. And if we are going to see increased export business that the USDA seems to project, then I don't think basis is going to all of a sudden fall apart at the ports, so it should hopefully continue to just be fairly normal.
Next week, Roy Smith will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. In our previous episode of Market Journal, we discussed the precautions producers need to take before allowing livestock to graze fields with downed corn. This week, we'll look at the nutrition needs of cows when they're on corn stalks. University of Nebraska-Lincoln research shows utilizing open fields can be economically beneficial for beef cow producers. Nebraska Extension cow-calf specialist Karla Jenkins joined us earlier this week from the Panhandle to discuss the nutrient requirements of those grazing animals. We started our conversation by asking for a review of how producers can determine the amount of residue in a field.
There is about 16 pounds of dry matter of residue for every bushel of corn per acre that was produced. And so about half of that residue is actually available to cattle because they're going to trample some and you're going to lose some. And so really, if you had a 200 bushel per acre field, then you take that times the 8 pounds, you've probably got about 1,600 pounds of dry matter residue available for the animal. And so if you estimate a mature cow eating about 26 pounds of that per day, then you can kind of estimate about how many days she would be able to use that, or how many cows per acre you would be able to put out there. And so those are ballparks that you can start with, and obviously you have to watch the condition of the cows and that sort of thing, but that gives you a ballpark starting point of how many you could run depending on the yield of the corn.
What are the nutrient requirements first for late summer or fall calving cows?
Well, if you're taking pairs out to the stalks, which a lot of times people are, if the cow is giving birth in late summer or fall, then she's taking that calf with her out to stalks. And so, number one, her needs are pretty high because of lactation. Lactation requires quite a bit more energy than just a dry gestating cow, almost twice. And so she's going to require, just for herself, about 16, 17 pounds of TDN per day that she needs to consume out there. And then the calf is going to start eating feed very quickly as well. It's not just on a milk diet. So you have to account for how much they're going to eat, but also the nutrient quality of that. And so if that cow is eating, let's say 28 pounds of of dry matter out there, and it's only 50% TDN because it is husks and leaves and just the residue. That's actually only giving her about 14 pounds, and she's short because she may need 16, 17. So in research studies that we have done, we've been able to maintain those fall calving pairs on cornstalk residue, a nice available field, plenty of residue available, plus about 5 pounds of distiller's grains per day per pair.
Would those pregnant cows have a different nutrient requirement then?
So a pregnant cow that's not got her calf with her, so she's had the requirements of lactation removed, she's dry, she's just pregnant, she's just waiting out the winter, her energy requirements are about half that, so she may be down to only needing 8 to 10 pounds of TDN per day, and that could easily be met out there on those residue fields. It's pretty debatable whether she actually needs a protein supplement out there or not. Research at the University of Nebraska would suggest that providing her a protein supplement will certainly increase her body condition out there and make her look nicer out there, but after she had the calf that she was carrying and went to rebreed with the second calf, she didn't actually rebreed any better or wean a bigger calf than the cows that didn't receive any supplements. So producers need to certainly keep cows in good condition while they're out there, but they need to be cognizant of her needs because there's also no reason to spend extra money on supplement if she doesn't need it.
You've also done some research looking at the profitability of cows grazing stalks versus dry lotting. Tell me quickly what that looks like.
So the calves coming off the corn stalks didn't weigh as much as the calves in the confinement, and that can throw producers off a little bit because we always want that bigger weaning weight. But the cost of maintaining those pairs, even though we were limit feeding the cows in confinement, was higher than what we were able to rent those corn stalks for. So the net profitability of running those fall pairs on corn stalks was actually better than the cows in confinement, even though the cows in confinement had a better condition score than the cows on corn stalks, and their calves weighed heavier. Once you did all the economics to that, the cows on corn stalks actually made you a little more money.
You can find more information about the nutrient requirements of cows grazing corn stalks through a link on the Market Journal website, or you can contact your local Nebraska Extension office. The latest progress report from Nebraska's National Agricultural Statistics Service shows the state's farmers are 68% complete with this year's corn harvest. That means many producers will soon begin to think about purchasing seed for 2018. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems joined us recently to explain how to use disease histories for hybrid selection. While we normally talk with Tamra about controlling diseases during the growing season, she says using information from previous crops now can be a beneficial management practice.
Well, selecting the right seed corn hybrid can help you manage diseases in a few different ways, but this is our first step in managing diseases. And you can start that the year before you ever plant by looking back at your records and reviewing which diseases were problematic in which fields. And you can select the hybrids that have the best ratings from the seed companies and give you a better chance of having resistance to those diseases and reducing losses caused by them.
Which level of incidence or what level of incidence should make you concerned and say, I need to manage this in a certain way?
Well, we've talked a lot about the impact of weather on diseases, and so diseases fluctuate from year to year. But if you've had it out there, for the most part, except for our rust diseases like southern rust and common rust, everything else overwinters, and so the pathogens are still out there. And you can count on those diseases returning again when weather conditions are right. And so if you have consistent problems with a disease or several of them, it would be worth considering resistant hybrids. And in many cases, if you're also trying to reduce input costs, it might help you avoid or delay a fungicide application.
What diseases specifically could be managed by seed corn selection?
Well, we do have a lot of really good hybrids out there for gray leaf spot resistance, and gray leaf spot can be managed with a fungicide, but there are other bacterial diseases that can't be. And so probably our best examples are Goss's bacterial wilt and blight and the newer one, bacterial leaf streak. Now, although we don't have ratings for most of our companies yet for bacterial leaf streak, many of them have a good idea of which ones may have performed better in some of those areas. But Goss's bacterial wilt is something we should talk about because a lot of people saw that in different areas across the state, especially in fields that got hailed. and they may have seen disease that they hadn't seen in a while, and it might have been a surprise. Well, it's a good reminder that that pathogen does overwinter very well, and that we should continue to select resistant hybrids even if you haven't seen it in a while.
Are there any other tips for reading those ratings and using them to try and make your selections?
It can be really confusing, so I think it'd be a good reminder to remind everyone that not every seed company uses the same rating scale, and even if they are using the same rating scale, like a 1 to 9, that it's not always the same direction. And so a 1 might be good for one company, and a 1 might be on the less desirable end for another company. So just familiarize yourself with the rating scale before you get started.
We often talk about lodging at harvest as a sign of problems. With the amount of wind we had during this year's harvest, how can you tell if it was because of wind specifically or because it was of disease and weakening of the stalk earlier?
This year we're having a tough harvest with the amount of stalk rot disease that developed at the end after all the rain. Well, that's a good indication too, and a reminder that stalk rot diseases are often a result of cumulative stress from earlier in the season, and it can be any kind of stress, whether it's leaf diseases or maybe we had some ponding in fields or even some drought stress in some of the corners or whatever. And so while we may have had good standing corn at the end of the season when we normally would harvest, over the next and last few weeks, as we've had more rain and wind, we've seen some of those deteriorating. Well, some of those fungal diseases that cause stalk rot are very common, and they're literally in every field. And so they probably want to be mindful of which fields were at higher risk and be sure and to reevaluate stalk strength. And knowing which diseases are out there, they can select better hybrids to manage that as well. And some companies have very good ratings for that too.
Let's finish talking about bacterial leaf streak. If you can manage it with other ways other than seed corn selection, tell me what you're learning about that through your studies.
We have a number of different studies on bacterial leaf streak right now, and one of those is a Farm Bill grant-funded study, and that one's at multiple locations across our state in different environments where we've had a history of bacterial leaf streak. And one of the things we're looking at is evaluating some of our local and common crop rotation sequences and also some of the common local tillage practices, whether that's conventional or no-till or even strip tillage. And so at these locations across the state, we're evaluating disease development, and we're seeing some differences right now in the way that disease develops across the season. And so we hope after we get yield data in, we'll have a lot more to share with everyone.
Next week, Nebraska Extension entomologist Julie Peterson will join us to talk about selecting Bt corn traits for 2018. The November Nebraska Farmer says there aren't many vineyards that have cattle panels across from the tasting room. But Niobrara Valley Vineyards, tucked away in the northern Nebraska Sandhills, is no ordinary vineyard. This month's issue says Niobrara Valley is a vineyard for ranch country, with wines named Boss Cow and Rancher's Red. Brothers Tim and Greg Nillette founded Niobrara Valley 15 years ago with their families. You can read about their history in the November Nebraska Farmer. We also have a look at hog markets this week with Iowa State Extension livestock economist Lee Schulz. Each year, the American pork industry exports just more than 20% of its total production. In terms of volume, only the multi-nation European Union ships more pork than the U.S. But American farmers have so far had a good year. Through the first 9 months of 2017, U.S. pork shipments were up 8% from the same period a year ago, including an 18% increase to the top buyer, Mexico. That strong foreign demand has helped the domestic market, which saw a sizable price surge during the month of October. We talked with Lee Tuesday afternoon and began by asking him to describe that rally.
Well, it's really been quite a month. When we look at prices bottomed late September at 54.11, the 30th of September, and really bounced back up to 67.08 as we look at October 31st, and we've really pretty much bounced in that range. We look at prices on Monday were 66.56, so really about a $12 increase over the month of October. Comparing to year ago levels, year ago we were about at 50.69, so we're about $16 higher than year ago levels.
And what's behind it?
I think it's a combination of factors. First, it is really the increased competition from packers. We have the 2 new additional packers that are ramping up to full capacity, not quite there yet, but we are seeing that competition. And also really the robust demand, both from a domestic situation as well as an export situation.
Well, the deferred contracts are offering even more strength. What does that mean?
I think it's really reflecting the demand situation that we are seeing and the market's ability to really slaughter and process these hogs very much in a timely fashion. Marketings are very current. I wouldn't say we're pulling hogs ahead, but we're not seeing really any buildup of supply. So that's really being reflected out in those futures contracts. Also, I think the market's really banking on this continued strong demand as we continue to see, larger export sales. Domestic demand has been very steady. We're seeing, restaurant performance index looking at current expectations are a bit steady, but the forward outlook is relatively well. So I think that's really pointing to maybe a better situation in 2018 than we expected, and the futures markets are reflecting that.
Have isoine prices kept up?
They have. When you look at SEW prices, 10 to 12 pound pigs, we're in that $41 to $42 range. Formula prices are about $7 higher than year ago levels. Cash prices, which is really that barometer of profitability, are about $17 higher. So we're right now, those placements of 10 to 12 pound pigs are pricing against that May market in 2018, and we see those deferred futures contracts continue to increase. And so I think that's really given that support to those cash prices for SEW pigs. Feeder pigs, 40 pounds, they're pricing against that March market, and even there we've seen those $25 higher than year ago levels.
You had mentioned those whether or not producers were pulling hogs forward. What are we seeing for weekly slaughter totals?
We're seeing weekly slaughter about 3% above year ago levels, and that's really what we've seen the last several weeks. There was 1 week there, October 14th, the week ending, we did see that 9% higher, but overall we've averaged out about 3% higher recently. Theoretical capacity is about 2.632 million head per week. I don't think we're likely to see that level. We may touch that 2.6 level. The highest slaughter week we've seen was September 30th, was at 2.528 million head per week. And so, those slaughter levels are bigger than year ago levels, but we very much expected that with the increase in production, and now we have that added slaughter capacity.
I want to talk about foreign demand, and specifically in China, where I think the numbers are a little bit more disappointing than many analysts were hoping. They're down, I believe, 30% on the year. What's behind it?
Well, this really shows China export demand and really their purchasing behavior. So year to date through September, exports by volume are down 30%. But compare that to year ago levels when they were up 111%. So last year was a very good year. Actually, when you look at exports to mainland China, we're at levels of about 2014. So I think we're really in levels we've seen in the recent past, but maybe not as good as year ago levels. I think when we look at exports in general, November is going to be a big month to really monitor because of that demand situation, that needed demand that we do see. We're seeing more pork production, and so November may be a real turning month if we continue to push prices higher, if we continue to see those export sales. If we do see them start to wane a bit, that could help steady or pressure prices downward.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast, and during this last week we just basically seen a roller coaster in terms of temperatures. Below normal for one day, above normal the next day. About the only significant moisture that we had during the 7-day period was across the western portion of the state into central Nebraska, particularly in the Monday through Tuesday time frame, where we did have some snowfall accumulations anywhere from up to 5 inches in the southern panhandle to a general 1 to 3 inch coverage across the center portion of the state just to the north of Interstate 80. For the rest of us, a few flurries or no precipitation whatsoever. And as we go through this next 7-day period, it doesn't look like there's going to be many chances for significant moisture. So as we go to the upper ear models, first thing we'll show you is that we do have a little bit of a trough that's moving across the state. Right now it looks like moisture is going to be very limited with this system, and we've seen a little bit of drizzle associated with it. The main surface low down to our south really trying to lift a lot of moisture well to the north, and we're too far away from that low pressure system to really generate a lot of moisture. So looking at a fairly dry map here across most of the country. Now as we go into tomorrow, we start to see ridging taking place in a much warmer pattern, as surface high starts to build into our region. There is showing some low pressure system up in the Dakotas, but it looks like that isn't going to have any moisture associated with it, and whatever it does form looks like it's going to be just basically from the Nebraska border to the east. Now as we go into Monday, we start to see that trough building a little bit farther into the western United States, bringing that ridge up into our region, bringing much warmer air. We do see some southerly flow with this little low pressure system highlighted here in the Texas Panhandle, but once again, there's really not much in the way of active weather expected even with that low pressure system. That trough quickly starts to move across the northern plains, bringing us a shot of cool air as we go into Tuesday afternoon and Tuesday evening. High pressure will settle into our region, so we're going to return back to some cooler conditions. A little bit of light precipitation in the Central Rockies, but once again, most of the moisture is still associated with that troughing pattern in the western United States. Then we start to see that starting to dig a little bit into the western United States. Low pressure over the Central Rockies will generate some moisture, but it will not have any impact whatsoever on us, as most of that moisture stays right along the eastern seaboard and over the Great Lakes. Now as we get into the day Thursday, a quick trough again moves across the region, brings us another surge of cool air. Any moisture associated with this looks like it would be across the southern plains, and even there we're looking at very light precipitation amounts, less than 1/4 of an inch. The main precipitation that we would expect accumulating moisture will be all to the east of us, and then we start to see that trough really deepen as we get into Friday. That's going to bring a pretty significant shot of cool air to the east of us. Most likely the coolest areas of the state will be eastern Nebraska, with a warming trend developing across the western part of the state as ridging starts to build in for the weekend. So we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast from next Thursday through the following Tuesday, highlighting that ridge building into our region. And unfortunately, with that ridge comes drier than normal weather, precipitation both on east and the west coast. We'll start to watch this trough for signs that it may cause some problems during the Thanksgiving Day weekend, but so far it looks fairly safe for us.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on the USDA's November crop report, nutrition requirements for cows grazing corn stalks, using disease histories to select corn varieties, and U.S. pork export numbers. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Next week, Roy Smith will be our market analyst, and Bryce Anderson will give an update on the outlook for La Nina conditions. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.